My boyfriend says he never believed in love at first sight until he met me. I knew it sounds cliché, but I know he really means it. Until he met me, Dean says he never knew it was humanly possible to love someone so much that you will never look at another person again. So much that you had to spend every second that you could with them. So much that, suddenly, that person was inserted in all of your plans and dreams for the future. Dean says that before he met me, he didn't know what it meant to need somebody. He didn't understand that once you met your soulmate, you can't breathe without them. That once you realize that half of your soul is in another person's body, you simply can't survive without them. That's how you know you are meant to be together. Dean had lovers before me, of course, but he never got to experience true love with any of them. They all seemed so perfect at first, but eventually, they all let him down. Hell, a couple of them just ghosted him completely, never bothering to even leave a note or even come back and get their shit from the house. They let him on, even meet his family, and then leave him to shamefully explain why they weren't at the next event. So, obviously, Dean had some issues with trust. Before he met me, Dean had never experienced the safety of a truly devoted relationship where there's nothing to worry about, and no stress, because it's so obvious that you will be together the rest of your lives. Before we were together, Dean still cared so much about what other people thought. He was constantly on the phone with his mom, his sister, his boss. Everyone had to be happy. But finally, he discovered that all we needed was each other, our dog, and our remote property in the woods. Life is so simple now. I tend to the garden, make his meals, sew his clothes, whatever he needs. In our many blissful years there, Dean has grown so much emotionally. He has really come to understand the meaning of true love and destiny. And the sooner he stops fighting me, the sooner he can feel how wonderful it is for himself. Dean never believed in love at first sight until he saw me fall in love with him that magical day all those years ago. He didn't know the lengths a soul would go to in order to make certain nothing, and nobody, throws our fate off course. Not his meddling mother, not his demanding boss, not those gold diggers who pretended to love him. Not even him. Believing in love is half the battle, but until he feels it the way I do, I'm going to have to keep him down there. I don't know why he keeps praying someone finds him. There's no one to look for him anymore. This happened to me about 3 years ago and still haunts me to this day. For a short while after graduating high school, I moved in with my aunt who lives about 30 minutes outside Grand Rapids in a small quiet suburb. She was kind enough to house me and feed me, but she required that I pay for all of my other expenses like doctors, clothes, toiletries, etc. In order to pay for these things, I decided to get a job as a pizza delivery boy at the local pizza shop. For about 2 months the job went smoothly with me making enough money to pay for all of my expenses, plus extra to mess around with. It was a Friday evening in late September when I arrived at the pizza shop to clock in. I'm from New Jersey, so it would normally still be warm out this time of year, and I remember being a little annoyed that I had to stop wearing shorts and start wearing a sweatshirt out. After making 2 deliveries relatively close by, we got a call for a delivery that was in the neighboring town about 25 minutes out. The suburb I was staying in was the last suburb of Grand Rapids, and this neighboring town was very rural, with houses spread far apart, and lots of farmland in between. This annoyed me because the roads were always dark with barely any street lights out there, and it would be almost an hour round trip for a small order. Anyways, I got the pizza order and started on my way out. About a half an hour later I arrived to this relatively large house on a side road with no other houses on it. I get out of the car noticing I'm surrounded by wheat fields for as far as I could see. This street had no street light, and the only light I could see was the porch light of the house. I went up to the door and rang the doorbell, waiting about 5 minutes with no answer, so I decided to ring it again. After the second ring, I could hear what sounded like to be an elderly lady call out to me asking me to wait a minute. After waiting for what seemed to be another 5 minutes, an old, short, white-haired lady opened the door and greeted me with a big smile. After handing her the pizza, she invited me to come in and wait while she gets her wallet, so that I wouldn't have to wait in the cold. I politely declined, as I knew in the back of my head that it's never a smart thing to do. She seemed shocked to hear this and asked once again. After saying no a second time, she started to look a little annoyed, asking me in one more time. At this point I started thinking to myself that she probably could have gotten the money in the time she's wasting just standing here asking me to come in. After declining a third time, she turned around and placed the pizza on a small table in the walkway, then turned to look at me again, asking for a fourth time to come in. At this point I thought to myself how much time this lady is wasting. Not only did I have to drive 30 minutes to her house, I also stood outside waiting for her to come to the door for another 10, and I have now been going back and forth with her for another 5 minutes about me not waiting in her house while she gets the money. After all this, I would have to drive another half an hour back to the pizza shop, and all this time, I thought to myself about an hour and a half in total for a $5 tip was so not worth it. After declining a fourth time, she asked again, this time stating that she needed help counting the money for me, as it was hard for her to see the denominations. I decided that this was too much of waste of time, and told her she could have the pizza for free. As soon as I said this, her smile vanished, and I turned away to get back into my car ASAP, as she was starting to freak me out. As I start making my way down the porch steps, she yells at me to come back as she has a $50 bill, and that I could just keep the change. Immediately after saying this, I start to hear some rustling in the wheat field straight ahead of me, and I felt my heart drop as I saw the wheat being pushed down closer towards me. At this moment I knew there was someone in the wheat field, and I ran across the street to my car, getting in and locking the doors instantly, starting the car and getting ready to floor it. As I throw the car and drive and slam on the gas, a horrible screeching sound surrounds me, as my car accelerates slower than I had anticipated down the street. About 3 seconds later, two powerful pops about a second apart fill my eardrums, as I find it harder to control the car. I then see out of my left side view mirror sparks coming from my left rear tire, and realize my tire has popped. I felt like I was about to throw up. Of course this happens now and not any other time. I decided that I could give a shit less about the damage driving on a flat was going to cost, and continued to floor the car down the street. I called my boss while driving down the dark roads, and he told me to call the police, as it is highly unusual that someone would ask me 4 times to enter their house, and even offer a higher price after being gifted free pizza. I hung up and called the police and told them everything that happened, and they told me they would send a patrol car over to check it out. At this point I was about a mile away from her house when a third loud pop broke the silence, and my car veered hard to the right. I pulled over as driving felt near impossible and got out of the car to see what was wrong. Both my rear tires and my front right tire had all been blown out, and at this moment I knew I wasn't going anywhere. I called the police and asked if they could send another patrol car to my location, so that I could be picked up and dropped back off at this pizza shop, where I could then make plans for a tow company to get my car. For about 10 minutes I sat on the side of a pitch-black road, with no houses in sight, still shaken up about what had just happened at the house. I replayed the events over and over in my head, and the image of the wheat moving and the sound of something approaching made me sick to my stomach. I wanted to get out of there and just go home and lock all the doors. I then see the police headlights pull up behind me, and I immediately get out to thank him. The policeman gets out too, and says he would like me to give a statement about what happened at the house, while his partner is there checking it out. While giving my statement I mentioned that 3 tires blew out, and how unlucky I was for that to happen at this time. Immediately he gave me a troubled look, pointing out how rare it was for 1 tire to blow out, let alone 3. He started looking at all my tires and then noticed that in my front driver's side tire, there was an obvious slash from what seemed to be a knife. He told me it looked as if someone slashed all my tires while I was on the porch of the house, and he immediately connected the dots, saying this was a setup to possibly abduct me. He told me that he thinks the plan was that the old woman would lure me into the house where another person would then restrain me. At the same time he told me someone was probably in the fields, going to my car to slash the tires, that way I couldn't escape, and the noise I heard in the field right in front of the house was probably him returning. He thinks the reason why the woman yelled so loud to take the $50 was to alert the man that I wasn't cooperating, and he would have probably abducted me himself and ushered me into the house. But luckily my quick thinking allowed me to escape in time. We drove back to the police station where we met with his partner, who said no one answered the door after he knocked and waited, and it appeared as if all the lights on the inside of the house were off, and there was no sign anyone was home other than the illuminated porch light. I quit that day, and I still have nightmares thinking about what could have happened to me if I had entered that house. I always try to do what my parents ask of me. I keep my elbows off the table and don't speak with food in my mouth. I study hard at school and avoid conflicts when they arise. They would rarely ever raise their voices at me. Just that one time I broke Aunt Esther's expensive vase. And that other time I ran out into the road to get my ball. I was scolded until I cried, my face red and cheeks wet with tears. I promised to be careful, and they eventually told me they loved me. They said they were just worried about my safety, and they apologized for raising their voices. They kissed my forehead and told me it was fine. I promised to look both ways and to never cross without their permission. I not only promised, but I followed through, making sure the road was clear when I crossed the street to play in the park. I did everything that was asked, but one day, a car appeared out of nowhere. It was going too fast to stop, despite the screeching tires as the driver slammed down the brakes. My parents wept as they looked down at me. Dad turned his head to puke. I tried to tell them I was okay, but they kept crying, and Mom kept screaming, "My baby, they killed my baby." I couldn't move when a strange man in an apron pumped something thick into my blood on that metal table. I couldn't move when I was placed into a cushioned box. I couldn't move when everyone gathered to talk about me at church, and then they lowered me into the ground. After the lid was closed and the dirt thumped the box's lid, I could still hear my parents from up above. They said it was unfair. They couldn't let go of me. Mom cried for me to come back, she begged me to, and I started to gather my strength. It took weeks, but I eventually clawed through that box's wooden lid. I crawled up through the damp, wormy soil. I crawled all the way back home, my twisted legs unable to carry me. I came back, just like they wanted. I crawled up the stairs and into their room to show them. I raised my heavy head and dangling jaw, and I smiled. I expected them to be so proud of me, but they don't look happy at all. They look more terrified than they ever have before. Worst of all, even though I did just what they asked, my parents won't stop screaming at me. Used bookstores are the best. My favorite is one owned by a friendly old man named Mr. Thompson. I've been going there for years, sifting through books on a myriad of topics. Mr. Thompson was a childhood friend of my grandfather. They were born only a few days apart, so he let me read without having to pay. Recently, he has allowed me access to a small room in the back, overflowing with books, that can't fit into the shelves in the main store. It's a dimly lit room that looks lost in time. The smell of old books fills your lungs each time you enter. The antique table and chair make it the perfect reading spot, aided by the glow of a lamp. I can sit back, relax, and be transported to another world. In fact, I often stay until after closing time. A few days ago, I found in this room the eeriest book I had ever encountered. It had been handwritten, and on the cover was the inscription "Diary of a Serial Killer." The writing was a little smudged and messy, indicative of a manic mind. On the first page was the date it had been started, 1794. A shiver went down my spine as I read the gruesome details of the murders, in the killer's own words. It seemed the killer got his kicks from having his victims dig their own grave. The last entry detailed where the killer's final victim had been buried. Chillingly, it was quite near the store, in a small wooded area. I discussed each book I read with Mr. Thompson, and this one was no different. I told him that curiosity had gotten the better of me, and that I would be setting out that evening to investigate whether or not this was all a sick joke. I began my search for the poor victim. I was digging for hours, but I could not find the corpse. I laughed at myself for how I had fallen for such a silly story. As I turned to walk away, I noticed Mr. Thompson emerge from behind a tree. Something about the sinister smile on his face told me I had read the date wrong in the diary, and that I had just unwittingly dug my own grave. Mrs. Watson walks the aisles between our desks, returning our graded tests. I am one of the few students who isn't nervous. I check the grade at the top when I receive my paper, A+. One girl begins to cry softly when she sees her grade. I ride my bicycle home. I won't bother telling mother and father my test grade when they come home. They know their youngest child is one of the best students in school. My sister Mary arrives home soon after, her face pale and hair in a snarl, as if she had tangled her hands through it. She paces in the kitchen. "Do you think it'll be me?" she asks. I roll my eyes. "If it is, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. Honestly, you've had so many chances to do better." Mary looks panicked. "How can you say that, George?" I shrug. "I'm just saying that statistically speaking, your odds are looking grim." Mary slaps me across the face, tears in her eyes. "You're a horrible person, you know that." Mother and father walk in the door, interrupting our argument. Father silently unclasps his briefcase, and we gather around as he removes a letter and puts on his reading glasses. Father begins to read, his voice dry and unhurried. "We write to inform you that your daughter, Mary Wells, has been randomly selected from this month's unexceptional pool. Please report tonight at 12 o'clock at the Forlorn Hollow." Mary begs father and mother to help her, tears falling unabashedly. We turn away, ashamed of our association with her. I volunteer to escort Mary this evening and father nods. "If only you had been more like your brother," father tells her bitterly. We leave that evening at 11:30. Mary's face is red and bloated from tears, but she elicits no pity from me. We enter the woods near town and follow the signposts, Mary sniffling the whole way. We arrive at the entrance of the hollow when Mary stops suddenly. "We don't have to do this. We could just run away." "I don't have to do anything. You're the one who is unexceptional. George, do you really want to live in fear that someday it could be you who ends up here?" "Nonsense. My grades ensure I'll never be entered into the unexceptional pool." An unearthly groaning shakes the ground and forces us to put our hands over our ears. The elder will wait no longer. We move forward into Forlorn Hollow and walk until we reach a mammoth cave. A deep voice emanates from within the void in a language that is as ancient as time itself. Mary's feet move forward without her permission. She screams and pleads as an enormous beak appears at the mouth of the cave. Barbed tentacles snake around her ankles and drag her into the waiting maw. I turn back before I see the carnage. I've already witnessed it 3 times before. I've kept myself awake for the last 17 days. The first 24 hours wasn't so bad. The first 48 was bearable. By 96 hours, I couldn't remember my name, couldn't hold a coherent thought, and was having trouble remembering what month it was. As days passed, I found myself almost unable to stand or keep my eyes open. This is when I shot myself up with adrenaline and clipped off my eyelids with toenail clippers. I can't say it wasn't painful, but that's what absurd quantities of oxycodone are for. I should also state that my bottom eyelids are gone as well. I don't remember clipping those. I'm just happy that I can no longer shut my eyes. I'm counting 102 empty bottles of this scene. A necessity now. If my eyes dry out, I go blind, and then I'll be truly lost. I nearly had a coronary by day 5. Beyond that, I don't remember much of anything. According to the calendar, I'm now on day 17. I'm currently standing in 2 rooms at once, one leg in the bedroom, the other in the bathroom. I'm walking through walls. God doesn't want us to sleep. It's how the devil keeps us feeble. If you're always alert, he can't get you. Video diary, Bobby Branton. I'm documenting now, and I have it all on camera. My older brother is supposed to be babysitting me for 2 weeks. Something is wrong with him. This morning, I looked him in the eyes and screamed. He's all cut up, and his face is drenched in blood. I ran to the basement and forced myself into a tight crawl space. He knows I'm here, but he can't let himself in here to get to me. He's kept me awake almost every night by chanting incantations, or something, in his room. Last night, I was so exhausted that I fell asleep. When I woke up, around 2:30 a.m., I could smell something burning. That's when I saw my brother Jamie standing in the corner. He was levitating off of the ground, and staring at me with his arms outstretched to the sides, like Jesus on the cross. His smile frightened me. "Come with me," he said, before and I swear to be true, turning, and floating right through the walls. Now I can smell burning all throughout the house. The chanting is getting louder, and a little while ago, he came down into the basement, and tried stabbing me with a syringe. I don't know what was in it. I'm still in the crawl space. I'm trying to be quiet. Now, he's sitting on the steps, just leering at me, telling me to come out and join him. He's twirling a pair of toenail clippers in his hands, telling me the devil wants us to sleep, because that's how the demons creep up on us. I saw Mom and Dad's car in the driveway. I know they came home, but I don't know where they are. All I know is that Jamie has a lot more blood on him than he did a few days ago. He told me, if you fall asleep, you won't be safe anymore. But after I inject you, you'll be in paradise with me. Shit is. I also brought up the clearing we were at, and how weird it felt to me. I wanted to know if he felt like that too, or if I was just exaggerating. My anxiety makes me do that sometimes. To which he said, yeah. He noticed the change in the air too, and said it made him feel dizzy and worn out. But he also said it just could have been from the long day we had. So on that note, it was time for bed. We both slept in same tent. It's the middle of winter and bundling up can only do so much, plus he was like a brother to me. It had to be around 1 a.m. when we both woke up to sound of the most horrible scream I'd ever heard. What that fuck was that? Was my first though. I'm guessing my friend was thinking the thing as he looked at me with fear on his I know because I was afraid too. So he grabbed his gun, loads around into the thing, and we just sit there for a while and listen. Now I know my friend is at least safe, he's got a gun, but I have nothing. Fear and my anxiety start getting the better of me, so I asked, "Where's the hatchet we used to split wood?" "Out there by the fire," he said. So I tell him I'm gonna open the tent, grab the hatch, and when I jump in, you seal the thing back up. I open the tent and as fast as I can bolt to grab that hatchet. As I go to turn around, it's hatchet in hand. I'm quickly greeted by my friend shoving me down by the back of my neck. He put his finger up to his mouth to tell me to be quiet, and we listened. In the distance I can hear the slow sound of crunching snow and a faint high-pitched guttural growl. Now I'm in full panic mode. We don't even have to say anything to each cause we both know our hunting trip was over, and it was time to leave. All we had to do was make it to the truck, in the dead of night. It sounded so, but it wasn't, and I knew it from the moment I heard, "I'm gonna fire a warning shot," before I could even open my mouth to tell him no. It was too late. The shot rang in the distance, and for a moment there was silence. Then, we heard it. A scream, so soul-piercing it felt like it lasted forever. It definitely echoed and figured much more than this gunshot did. It was petrifying. I'd never heard such a haunting scream before. I was literally frozen in fear. Then, we could hear whatever made the scream was charging right for us with the sound of crunching snow. Getting closer and closer. We looked at each other and just ran in the direction of the truck, frantically sprinting, calling out to each other to make sure the other hadn't fallen behind. We are almost there, we kept telling each other, as we are weaving through trees, making a beeline to the truck, trying to ignore the sound of this growl that sounds like it's right in my ear, but I can see the truck. We are gonna make it, we are getting out of here. As we come up to the truck, my friend makes it to his side and unlocks both passenger and driver's side at the same time. As I open the door, he does too at the same time, and then he's gone in a flash of white. This thing had gotten him, ran at him with such force that when it tackled him, it shook the truck side to side. I stood there in shock. I call out to him, but all I can hear are screams and a couple gunshots, and then dead silence again. I know in my heart that my friend is dead, and so am I if I don't get the fuck out of here. I go over to the driver's side and find the keys on the ground. He must have let them go when he got tackled. I hop and start the damn thing, whip it around in the direction I need to get out of here. Then I saw it. Skin as white as snow, completely hairless, eyes that had sunken into its head, made dark circles around eyes that were just as white as its skin, no nose, teeth so jagged and sharp shine with the color of blood, and its lips looked like they had been chewed off, so all you're staring at is teeth. Its body was so disproportioned, long lanky limbs. This thing is blocking me from leaving, but I'm getting out of here no matter what. I floor it with the tire spinning. I shoot forward, and so does it, screaming that blood-curdling scream as it charges at me. Now I'm getting up close and personal, as this thing lunges at the truck and bounces at the hood, and over top of the truck. As I'm speeding away, I glance at the rear view mirror, and witness this thing get up, and just stand there, watching me drive off with its head tilted slightly. I knew I had just escaped death with the price of losing my friend. Got into my car, and I plugged the address into my GPS. This is where I noticed she lived, in Hamilton, which is about 45 minutes away from Toronto. It's currently 1 a.m., but this didn't bother me, as I drove to Hamilton quite often, and considering I was spending the night, I could just leave in the morning. Minutes later I find myself passing Hamilton. Okay, so it's a little further than that, no big deal, but then, I reached a stretch of highway void of any streetlights. This is where I start to get concerned, as I only had my own headlights lighting the way. Suddenly my GPS chimed in with a female voice, indicating my exit. It was coming up on the right, and I feared driving into the darkness off the mild comfort of the highway. The exit took me into a long dark stretch of country road. My warning lights start going off, as I pass silhouettes of farmhouses and forestry, a good distance between each of them. My GPS chimed again, indicating that my destination was coming up on my left, but as I approached the location, it's not even close to what I expected. It was a small church house, with one yellow street light, illuminating the dirt lot in front of it. I pulled into the lot, and took a closer look with my vehicle's headlights, pointed at the building. The windows and door were boarded up, and definitely not recently, as the wood seemed weather-worn. My blood began to run cold, as I made sure my doors were locked, and my windows rolled up. The full tank of gas gave me some kind of comfort in this situation. I figured she possibly made an error, while typing out the address, and called the number she gave me. The number you are trying to reach is no longer in service. Okay, at this point, I'm ready to turn and leave, until I noticed my phone alerting me that I have an email. It was a message from her. Hey, I see you're here. It's not the church, my place is the small house behind the church. All I could do is replay all of the horror movies I've seen in my life in my head, and I just couldn't believe I could possibly be living one out in real life. However, a small jolt of curiosity persuaded me forward, even if to just take a look at this house. There was a small path beside the church, and I slowly pulled into it. As I crept my car forward, a small little farmhouse poked itself out of the trees at the top of the hill. At this point I'm certain, I'm not going in there. I've made the decision in my head, that my own survival took precedent over the need for sex. I was about to reverse out of there, until I saw the upstairs balcony door open. A hooded figure stepped out. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell by the posture and shape that It was a man, despite the darkness of his facial features. I could feel that he was looking directly at me. He stood there for about 30 seconds, before he motioned his head in a way I recognized as the universal signal for "look behind you." Just then, I felt the metal handle on the outside of my driver door being tugged at. I quickly turned my head in that direction, to see the woman from the profile photos, hunched over and pressing her face up against the window. My heart leapt out of my chest, as I stared at her horrifying smile. The best way I can describe her expression would be any creepy cartoon image of the Joker you've ever seen. It was undoubtedly her behind that insane grin, only much older. She whispered through the glass, "Open the door, baby." I was frozen in my seat, unsure of how to respond, or even what to do next. So I just sat there, continuing to stare at her, like an idiot. Her face then quickly fell into an angry, malicious expression, as she continued to violently jiggle at the door handle. She then said slowly, "Get out of the car." This knocked me into panic mode, and I pressed my foot to the gas. My car set to reverse. The woman tried holding onto the car handle, only to let go shortly after being dragged off her feet. I flew down the dark road towards the highway, almost triple the speed limit, just in case they had a car themselves and decided to chase me. I called up a friend of mine, who I also met on the same website. She lived in Hamilton and insisted I come over and stay the night. When I got there, she poured me a cold glass of Coke Zero as I explained what happened. She told me that she read in a local paper about an older couple who lured men out to their farm. I stopped her right there, as I didn't want to be more freaked out than I was already. Run. Run. And if you can't run, then walk. And if you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, don't stop. It's only been an hour since everyone on Earth, as far as I could tell, heard those same words. I was already walking through the park when I heard them, and after seeing what happened, I won't be stopping anytime soon. It's been 2 hours now. I've kept walking. I'm tired, but stopping is not an option. Some people tried driving, but the act of getting in a car requires stopping, even for the briefest moment. And as those already driving when they heard the rules soon found out, it's impossible to move indefinitely in a vehicle, especially in a crowded city. Their screams kept me moving. It's been 4 hours now, and I'm exhausted, with the only thing pushing me forward being the fear of what awaits when I stop. And yes, I mean when, proven by plenty of those around me, eventually I'll have to stop. Some have just given up, accepting their fate only to immediately regret the decision. Some just couldn't take the screams anymore, and most simply don't see the point of continuing. And with every step I'm starting to become more like the latter. It's been about 6 hours, and for the first time I saw what happens up close. I was walking aimlessly down an alley, trying to get away from the madness, when I saw a young man no more than 16 crying. It didn't even register at first to me until he made eye contact with me. He had stopped moving. His eyes were bloodshot, and not just whites around his pupils. I mean the entirety of his eyes were crimson red. Black tears streamed down his expressionless face, and then he smiled. A wide toothy smile that would have screamed of joy, if it wasn't followed by animalistic screams that would give the biggest horror fanatic nightmares. I wish I could say witnessing his dying moments was the most horrific thing to happen to me today, but then it hit me, the realization that I had stopped moving. So this is a true story, and had happened to me roughly about 8 years ago. I had just finished locking up my store around 12 a.m. It was a long day and I stayed overtime to make sure I caught up with what needed to be done. So finally, after locking up, I made my way home. I lived roughly around 40 minutes away, so I put in my headphones and made my usual way home. On my way home, there is a shortcut through a small forest area about 5 minutes away from work. As I got to the entrance, I honestly did tell myself, "You sure about this?" As it was completely pitch black. There's a small narrow public path that leads you through it, but after 12 a.m. they switch off a lot of light sources to save money and electricity. And the lights in that forest are unfortunately part of the ones they switch off. However, reading this, you guessed it, I ventured through as it was a normal route for me. After getting about halfway through, I was just keeping my cool, my headphones still blaring music. That was until I reached the fork in the footpath. A bright light had just turned on, and peered around the corner from the trees from the side of me. It was roughly 12:15 a.m. There isn't a single light source in that forest. So immediately, with all the red flags, I took out my headphones, turned the music off, and dimmed the brightness of my phone to avoid any further possibility of drawing attention to myself. To make matters way worse, that light I saw had just turned itself off after I'd say spotting me. This sent me into fight or flight mode. I decided to continue walking slowly, following the dark path I was on. I knew running and panicking would only worsen my situation, and walking through it allowed me to listen closely to the sounds around me. Keep me on some sort of footing, just in case that someone did attack. But all I could hear was the wind in the trees, and the sounds of my own footsteps. This meant one thing, that someone was definitely hiding, and watching me from the dark. After careful and cautious navigation, I luckily managed to make it out and avoid any confrontation. But I remember I was ready for a fight then and there. I don't know how I held onto my composure, but I can definitely say there was someone in that forest that night, and I'm lucky I never found out who. I certainly made sure it was the last time I walked through there that late at night. Since I was a child, I was always terrified of being alone. In the early 90s, my parents bought an old large house with 3 floors and many rooms. Me getting scared of being alone was rarely a problem though, as my father worked nights and was home during the day. I also shared a bedroom with my older brother, so even at bedtime and through the night I wasn't alone. But on weekend nights, my family would gather around the TV on the 3rd floor. We would eat slices of loaf with shrimp that we had to peel the scales off of. Sometimes someone would forget to bring something, be it napkins or a drink, and I would get sent downstairs to the ground floor, where the kitchen was, to get it. I was always restless, and usually volunteered to do anything, which my mother loved, as my older brother had been quite difficult to handle. He was sometimes difficult for me to handle as well, teasing me whenever I said I was scared of being alone, or scared of the dark. Still, I looked up to him, and in trying to not seem like such a wimpy kid brother anymore, I kept whatever fears I had to myself, saying that I would go downstairs and get whatever they had forgotten to bring. In spite of being an old house, it was quite decent, with a lot of work done. Only a couple of the rooms were still in their old form. Otherwise, the interiors were typical of the 90s. From the upstairs TV room, I had to go down a long hallway, then down 2 separate stairs, then through another hallway, before ending up in the living room, where the door to the kitchen was. I would always think I could just force my brain to think about playing Super Mario Bros. 2 and I wouldn't get scared. But on these weekend family evenings, it was usually dark outside. As I crossed the first hallway, I turned and looked back at the TV room where my family was. The TV was faced my way, making my family face away from me. I tried not to think about it. The second I went down the first set of stairs, and the sound of the TV started to fade in the distance, images of big white faces would appear in my mind. They were bigger than a normal person's, and they just suddenly appeared in my imagination. The uneasiness and fear coming from thinking about them made the back of my neck tingle. Reaching ground level, I could see into the living room. On the wall on the opposite side of the room, facing me, there was a door to the veranda. It had glass panels that covered most of it. I had to walk towards it, before turning right inside the living room, in order to get to the kitchen. The veranda door was an easy place to get to from outside, to look inside from, so I quickly glanced up at it as I walked towards it, before looking down again. There was only the utter darkness of outside showing through the glass. I couldn't allow myself to think phew, there wasn't a face, because that would mean that I admitted to actually thinking there might have been one. So I just kept looking down, and walked hastily towards the living room, before taking a right into the kitchen. I quickly got what I needed, while I struggled to maintain the image of brightly colored Super Mario landscapes in my mind's eye, and I started walking back. Of course, running would only escalate the fear, and maybe activate whatever was hiding outside our house, or inside, around corners where I couldn't see. Right past where the stairs leading back up started, there was a corner on my left which led to the front door. I would always imagine a large white face or hand slowly starting to emerge around that corner. I took the 3 first steps of the stairs in one stride, feeling pain in my inner thigh as this was quite the reach for my small legs. But I needed to get up as quickly as possible without starting to run. And that corner where the stairs began freaked me out more than other corners. Luckily our stairs had panels under the steps, so there was nothing that could grab my feet as I went up. In the hallway on the middle floor, before the last stairs, there were 4 rooms that usually had open doors. Sometimes the lights would be turned off inside. Sometimes a door would be only slightly cracked open, and I would imagine seeing half of a face looking at me from inside the dark room. I would always think of the faces appearing at a height slightly above my own for some reason. I looked down at the floor again, and moved quickly past the doors to the final set of stairs. All the while it felt like the tingles on my neck started to move down to my back. I tried not to think of large white hands reaching at me from behind. Having gotten to the upper floor, I can see the entrance to the TV room across the final hallway. The door is almost fully open, and my family is waiting. I can see the back of their heads. Despite being almost double in length compared to the previous hallway, there are only 2 doors, one on the left close to the stairs, and one on the right further ahead, close to the TV room. Both are closed shut. Now I can finally run, so I go into a full sprint. Pictures hanging on the wall start to race past me as I rush towards the room where my family awaits. Then, straight ahead, the door to the TV room slowly starts to close. Instantly, without even considering why it's closing, I scream with everything I have for my mom. I don't stop running. I can only see my brother now inside the room as the door closes. With socks on a carpeted floor, I run faster than ever before, and I'm ready to literally throw myself into the room. My panic reaches new heights as I realize no one is answering me. Only a few meters more, just one more door to pass. In the last few steps, seconds seem like minutes. Just as I'm about to pass the final door on the right, it suddenly opens slightly, just a crack, and there is something pressed up against the opening looking at me. One is silver and the other's gold, the children sang on the bus. We were on our way to my first camping trip as a new scout leader, and I was ecstatic. The outing had almost been canceled due to the recent disappearance of a former scout, but we all thought it would be nice for the rest of the troop to get out in the fresh air. They needed this and we needed this. It would be a trip of healing. I had been warned ahead of time to keep a close eye on Blair. She had been close with the little girl that had gone missing just days prior. Apparently Rachel had been her best friend since childhood. When we reached the campsite, poor Blair was all alone, while the others picked their tent mates. I looked over at her overpacked bag and asked if she needed help to set up. With a grim smile she nodded and made her way over to a spot more than a few feet away from the nearest tent. "Are you sure you want to be so far from camp?" I asked nonchalantly. Blair didn't seem to mind the solitude though, poor girl. When I reached for her bag she stiffened. "I got it, Mel." "Thank you though," she added sweetly as she inched the bag toward her tent. I sighed. This was going to take some time. She was obviously hurt, and her level of trust had dissipated with the disappearance. From there we had crafts and snack time. I watched Blair closely attempt to mingle with different girls, almost out of place, but it was to be expected. She did seem to gain some traction with Rona around lunchtime though. They sat together and giggled a bit. I was happy to see she was finally making new friends. Once the sun began to set and the campfire was built, my happiness soon turned to worry. As I looked around the fire at all the young faces, I noticed one was missing. Blair's. My eyes kept searching until I realized Rona was also missing. Those silly girls, I thought to myself, were also happy that Blair had made a new friend. I silently excused myself from the fire and made my way over to Blair's tent. As I got closer, I vaguely heard the soft whisper of a song. Make new friends, but keep the old. I slowly opened up her tent and my stomach dropped as the smell hit me. Blair was inside, gently brushing Rachel's lifeless hair as Rona stared back at me, terrified. The knots we had taught them earlier wrapped tightly around her wrists as a gag trapped her mouth. One is silver, and the other's gold. Blair hummed softly before turning towards me, smiling. Porridge, am I right? I detested it as a kid. Perhaps it was the sticky, syrupy texture and how awful it felt as it traveled down my throat, enveloping my tonsils, making me feel like I was about to choke. Maybe it was its bland taste. Either way, it was rancid. My mother used to force me to eat it, every fucking morning without fail. Eat your porridge, Benjamin, she'd squeal. If I refused, she would hold my nose until I couldn't breathe, and then shove the disgusting gooey stuff down my throat. She really was a wicked woman. She relished in the suffering and misfortune of others. When little Patrick from next door fell off his bike and twisted his ankle, I watched my mother's mouth quiver, forming a smirk. It delighted her. As time went on, my mother became withdrawn. She was moody, barely venturing out of her bedroom. Except for when she had to feed me porridge. That was the only time I saw her. I didn't like how she looked at me though. There was this sparkle in her eye as she watched me lift the spoon into my mouth. Like she knew something that I didn't. She watched me spoon the detestable goo into my mouth, and a victorious smile would spread across her face. As if she'd won a battle. I guess she did. I just didn't know at the time. Pretty soon my porridge started tasting different too. It was somehow worse than before. Instead of the usual bland taste, my taste buds were assaulted by this sourness that I couldn't describe. It tasted spoiled. When I broached the subject with my mother, her face would turn as sour as the porridge that I was eating. Benjamin, I am sick and tired of your excuses. She'd hiss at me. Things only proved to escalate. The taste of the porridge grew more rancid and vile with each passing day. My mother became more and more manic. Her hair was a bird's nest that fell in awful, straw-like strands about her hunched shoulders. Her face was gaunt, pale, and her under eyes looked heavy, discolored like old tea bags. Her smile never wavered though. As soon as she put that detestable mucus in front of me, her mouth would quiver. One morning, I woke up to find our kitchen empty. No sign of my mother. I went toward her bedroom and noticed that the door was slightly ajar. As I walked in, this rancid, putrid smell hit me in the face like a brick. It was emanating from the bathroom. When I walked in, I almost fainted. My mother was elbow deep in the chest cavity of little Patrick, her arms saturated by rotten flesh and putrid tissue, all sticky and glossy. I peeked inside and saw the gooey, soupy mess that was Patrick. It looked exactly like my porridge. Are you ready for breakfast, Benjamin? Have you ever silently wished something terrible, or made a dark wish that harm would fall on someone? Be honest now, there's no point in lying to yourself. When I say, be careful what you wish for, because it just might come true, I mean it. Because for me, my most horrible wishes always do come true. I can't say for sure when it started, but I can tell you the first time that I know my horrible wish came true, the first time that I allowed a horrible thought to spend a few seconds in the front of my cluttered mind. If only I hadn't made such a horrible wish, my life would be dramatically different. I was in high school when it happened. My father had been distant for years, and seemed to not give a shit about anything. It seemed that the only times he would speak to me, he was lecturing, or even yelling at me for being too loud, wearing too much black, listening to heavy metal, or being 3 minutes late for curfew. One day, after a particularly long lecture about spending too much time with my girlfriend, I thought to myself, I wish he would just kill himself since he's so fucking miserable. The very next day as I arrived home, I entered through the garage, and was surprised to see my father's car inside. It was a Tuesday, so he should have been at work. I entered the house, and went to his room. He wasn't there. I walked down the stairs of our split-entry home and headed to the basement. As I walked through the hallway, I noticed a trail of blood trickling through the grout lines of the hallway tile. The trail was coming from underneath the bathroom door. I panicked and thought my dad must have had an accident. I hurried to the door, and swung it open expecting to see my father trying to clean up a serious cut. This wouldn't be the first time he cut himself while woodworking. As I opened the door, what I saw was far, far worse. I found my dad, or his body that is, sitting in the corner. At his feet lay his 10-gauge shotgun. His head had been split in half, and the only remnant of his face was part of his nose dangling from a piece of skin. I could see the remnants of his skull and brain scattered throughout his now open cranium. The wall immediately behind him had a thick spatter of blood, with protruding lines of blood splattered towards the ceiling, as if a water balloon filled with red paint had been thrown at it in an upwards direction. Since he had shot himself just under the chin, all the blood from his carotid arteries had poured down his front side, creating a stream that had found its way underneath the door crack. Somehow, there was blood and brain matter on all four walls and the ceiling. You don't understand how fickle the human body is until you see it scattered around like that. I felt guilty about wishing for my dad to kill himself. I felt like I should have seen the signs of depression, not wished him an untimely demise. I never felt like I had caused it though. It wasn't until much later that I finally realized that it happened because I had wished for it. I started getting suspicious the second time my horrible wish came true. This was in my senior year, and I was still dealing with some shit after my father's suicide. Although I wasn't heavily bullied, there was one kid that had a special vendetta to insult me at every corner. One particular day, he decided to tell me that my father had killed himself because I was so ugly. It was a stupid insult, I know that, but on that day I lost my shit. I punched him right in the teeth. As I was distracted by the immediate pain that seared through my hand and knuckles, he hit me back with a huge haymaker right to the nose, knocking me to the ground in front of every student in the cafeteria. He stood over me and continued to hit me repeatedly, while all I could do was keep my arms over my face. As I waited in the principal's office holding a towel to my broken nose, I thought to myself, I wish he could never talk again. As he was leaving the school, he tripped down the concrete stairs. A crack sounded as he landed directly on his chin. The kid started to make panicked gurgled noises as he struggled to his feet. His mom screamed as he stood up to show the blood that was pouring heavily from his mouth. His eyes were white as can be as we all looked down to see his tongue laying on the ground. He had bitten his tongue clean off. Needless to say, he was never able to speak again. This is when I began to get suspicious that my thoughts were more than thoughts. I felt as if my wish had caused that incident. That was the second time I had wished harm on someone, and it actually happened. I told myself that I was being crazy. If this happened to you, would you believe it? I finally convinced myself that I was being far too superstitious, and that there was no way that I could make these things happen with my thoughts. Until the third time, that is. I was driving down the interstate when another car flew past me at a ridiculous speed and cut me off. I had to slam on the brakes of my old beat-up Honda Civic, causing me to lose control. I regained control of my car, but lost control of my temper. This time I said it out loud. I hope that asshole crashes. Immediately after I wished it, the car's front tire blew. The vehicle lost control and turned sharply in the direction of the blown tire. With a loud screech of tires trying to stop, the car went bumper first into the cement barrier at 70 mph. The impact was so hard that the front wheels left the ground as it started to turn over. The car continued to roll several times before finally coming to a stop a few hundred feet after the original collision. I stopped my car and ran toward the heap of metal that was once a car. The driver was unconscious, but seemed to be stirring and alive. However, there was a woman in the car who had apparently not been wearing her seatbelt. Although she lay belly down, her head was twisted backward with her spine protruding from her neck. Her eyes were open, and those dead empty blue eyes stared at me, as if she knew that I had done that to her. As it turns out, the man was taking his pregnant wife to the hospital. She was in the back seat of the car, because she was in labor. The driver survived, but neither the mother nor the baby did. That's when I knew it. I had made that happen with my horrible wish. I had killed that poor woman and her unborn baby, just because I lost my temper. I still feel like a murderer. I even considered turning myself in the hope that justice would serve me, but who would believe that I had murdered that woman with my thoughts? I thought that I could maybe make things right by wishing wonderful, good things to happen. A family friend had been fighting cancer for over a year, and had just been determined as terminal. I wished every day that she would recover, that her cancer would subside. I wished as often as a priest prays, but nonetheless, she died 2 months later. I wished every day that my mother could find happiness after her husband's death, but positive wishes don't come true. My mother fell further into depression and substance abuse every day until she overdosed on opiates. You see, only my horrible wishes are granted. Like the time my girlfriend had cheated on me, so I wished that she would disappear. The next day she was gone, as if she vanished into thin air. That was years ago, and nobody has seen her since. It's a cold case now. Over the years, I've developed drinking and anger problems, and more than once have wished awful things in the heat of the drunken moment. Much like the bartender who cut me off, so now his left hand is cut off. Far too many innocent people have been hurt and killed because of my reckless thoughts, like the now paralyzed man that lived in the apartment above me, when my drunk ass wished that he couldn't make noise anymore. These stories are only a fraction of the people who I have hurt. I know that every time I get drunk there is a good chance that I will wish something awful, some sort of harm to someone that doesn't deserve it, but I just can't put down the fucking bottle. So today I give my last wish. I wish that tonight brings me the horrible death that I deserve.